election in May. We're joined by Samantha Maiden, firstly, from news.com.au. Sam, good morning.
Good morning.
And we have Maria Kovacic as well, who's a Liberal Senator for New South Wales. Maria, hello.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming into Parramatta on this public holiday.
It's my pleasure. Always happy to be here.
It's all politicians never really get holidays, do they?
No.
All right. So let's start with the situation with Andrew Hastie. Samantha, I might get your sense of this because I know your ear's always close to the ground in Canberra. What do you think is behind Andrew Hastie's shock move on Friday?
Look, I think that it is not a situation where you can expect there to be some sort of leadership rumble involving Andrew Hastie next week or even next month. But I think that he is clearly signalling that is something that he is interested in the future. And look, I suppose you're really not meant to say this, but I suspect that there is a bit of him almost being of the view that life is going to get very busy at some point in the next couple of years if he's actually successful in his mission, and he'd like to spend a bit of time for his family. He's even alluded to that in some of his public commentary. So whether or not he ever gets there is another open question. It's not clear he will ever get to climb that mountain, but he is interested, and it does add to that perception that there's a lot of firepower languishing on the backbench, even though in this case it's very much a decision of his own making. This isn't entirely unprecedented, is it? I remember the period when Tony Abbott spent some time on the back bench. I think he wrote battle lines back then. Maybe we'll see a think piece book coming out. Yep, could be. Tome. Yes. Perhaps some sort of outline, a manifesto, dare I say it, the Hastie Manifesto. I can't wait. But look, he is an interesting figure. I think that there's a lot of things that are, admirable about Andrew Hastie in terms of, his service overseas. I think that there's a really interesting backstory to some of the people that he's actually stood up to over his political career, whether that's Ben Roberts-Smith and, giving evidence for the 9 newspapers in relation to what he heard about what had gone on overseas and the concerns that people had about that. He's also stood up, for example, on the issue of China. But I was also talking and writing over the weekend about the fact that, he is been here for 10 years, so not a rookie. But I think there's also some questions about how much he knows about how Parliament works, how deals are done on the floor of Parliament. So he perhaps has some work to do in terms of filling out the whole picture, and it'll be interesting to see how he tackles that. But I think he does have cut through, and at the end of the day, that's what you need as a minister or a leader. Whether or not he goes all the way, I think that's still an open question. Certainly a high-profile departure, given that he was Shadow Home Affairs Minister. That's a key portfolio in any opposition. Maria Kovacic, what can you tell us from inside the party room about the move of Andrew Hastie?
Look, I think it's as simple and as clear as what he said. He received his charter letter in relation to his portfolio last week, as did all shadow ministers. One of the key criteria of that charter letter is around cabinet shadow ministerial solidarity. It's a part of our process and our system. He was unable to comply with that and made a decision to resign his portfolio and go to the backbench. I think he's been pretty clear about that. He's been pretty clear that, he's not seeking any kind of leadership at the moment. And he's also been pretty clear historically that he has long-term aspirations for leadership. So none of that is a secret.
Okay. So some key policy differences behind this. So we do know that in the coalition, of course, those with ministerial roles or shadow ministerial roles do need to follow the party line, but there's more space than there is in the ALP, for instance, for people on the backbench to come up with their own policies. I don't know if there are clear policy differences, though. I mean, I think that is a little bit disputed. This is what I'm coming back to ask about, Sam. So basically, if you talk to people close to Susan Lee, they will say that really he was looking for an excuse to quit, because they argue that they don't have a position down in stone yet on net zero. If anything, Susan Lee's made all the noises that she's, willing to make
some changes in that area. So there's not a clear position that he's opposed to Susan Lee on net zero. He's nailed his colours to the mast in terms of that he thinks that they should go in a different direction, but there's not necessarily a policy down in stone that he's resisting in that regard. And then when it comes to immigration, well, look, he's the Home Affairs Minister. That is the senior role to the immigration portfolio. He makes the point that when he got the charter letter that it basically said that immigration policy would be set by the immigration minister. But at the end of the day, there's two things to that. One is that Susan Lee's supporters make the point that he was briefed on that charter letter before he actually received it about a month ago, had bits read out to him, didn't complain about it, right? And also in relation to Home Affairs immigration, he'd still be the senior minister, so presumably he would be able to exercise influence, whether it is in shadow cabinet or in these discussions with the minister or the shadow minister that he would basically be supervising in some respect. So I think that there's a bit of a question mark here of why exactly he's decided to pull the pin. He seemed to be pretty keen to do so. He was even offered, or offered is the wrong word, he was sounded out about becoming the deputy leader, like as if they had a sort of moderate leader in Susan Lee, then they could have a conservative as a deputy. He wasn't interested in that. So I think there's a little bit of him wanting to, take a bit of a breather to kind of think about how he'd like to do things later down the track, and he doesn't necessarily want to be doing all the work and travel of being on the shadow ministry right now. Sure.
Samantha Maiden speaking from news.com.au, coming up to 9:15 on 702 ABC Radio Sydney and across New South Wales and the ACT. Maria Kovacic is with us as well, Liberal Senator for New South Wales. Maria, do you want to add to that, or shall we move on to the question of 000?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a chat about 000. That is something that is really important to Australians, and I think it's something that the government really needs to explain its inaction on, particularly when it comes to the legislation in relation to the 000 watchdog. I note that the Minister, Annika Wells, made the comment that she's a fairly new minister, so she's sort of taken some time to get into the ministry, but I don't think that that's an adequate response. She has the weight of her office, the weight of the department and the weight of the government behind her. And Australians should be confident in the 000 system. And you can't point to, Optus or to a telco and say it's an organisational problem or a corporate problem. This is a government problem, and they need to deal with it. And they've been aware of these issues for quite some time. And they have some serious questions to answer.
Here's some of what Annika Wells had to say about the situation. And she has summoned the CEOs of the top three mobile networks the three major ones that actually exist, to Canberra for a meeting on this.
They'll be getting together with me in Canberra tomorrow to make sure that we are all, from our individual positions in the system, doing everything we can to make sure that Australians do and can have confidence in 000 ahead of natural disaster season.
So she's saying that she's going to bring people in and get some results. Samantha Maiden, I mean, this is such an urgent system, and it's not a surprise that there have been problems with it, is there?
No, I think that there is this sense that Optus is the problem here, though, because, there have been previous incidents. The government has introduced reforms. My understanding is that even though those reforms don't come fully into effect until November 1, that Telstra and other telco providers have indicated to the government that they're already compliant. Optus seems to be the issue here. And look, there is obviously they're private companies, but there is a need, I think, for the government to step in. I do know that I think that the government is absolutely furious with Optus and what has happened, and I think that there's no lack of appetite to enforce really strong penalties, but it's a question really of how far and how fast they can come. I mean, obviously this was a sort of catastrophic technical outage. They had a firewall update, things went catastrophically wrong, but the government is very keen to ensure that there is a lot better protections in place in terms of these incidents being reported very quickly.
But these things happen within a regulatory framework, I guess, and there's the concept of a custodian for 000 has been floated in the past. the idea of someone actively monitoring to make sure. One of the key aspects of this, Maria, is the notion that if one mobile network falls over, everyone's phone automatically goes onto another network. So if Optus is out, your phone will use Telstra or use TPG/Vodafone to make a 000 call. I mean, this is something that a government could legislate on.
They could indeed, and I don't think it's enough for the government just to say, oh, we're furious with Optus. What we would like to see is an investigation into the entire 000 ecosystem, and that involves both the telcos, the regulator and the government. And we need to do that so that Australians can be confident in the rigidity of this system and the robustness of the system. People in a disaster or in an emergency should not be concerned about whether they are able to dial out 000 from their phone. That is the last thing that they should be worried about. And making noises about being upset is just not sufficient. And let me be frank, while the Minister has spoken about the fact that, she's relatively new and, she needs time, etc., this was all unfolding while the Minister was overseas in New York with the Prime Minister. I understand that there are competing priorities, but I would have expected that this meeting would have occurred weeks ago, not tomorrow.
Okay, so Maria, Kovacic is talking, Liberal Senator from New South Wales, about the 000 issue. Samantha Maiden, anything more to say on this? I mean, as you say, these are private companies. Someone's pointing out on the tax line, Catherine, that Optus doesn't pay tax in Australia, so their image has taken a bit of a battering in recent times. Some people listening will have had the unpleasant experience of having their data leaked on the dark web by Optus, among other problems too.
Yeah, they're really on fire, aren't they?
It does seem a little bit unfortunate. Their former CEO, of course, resigned over that issue. The current CEO is under pressure as well. This is ironically enough, this is a company that's largely owned by the Singaporean government's investment wing. So it is a public company, just not an Australian public company in a sense, Sam.
Yeah, look, I think that the phrase that I like to use in my family when issues like this arise is less than ideal. I think that it is less than ideal. They've seriously got some big problems on their hands.
Maria, any thoughts about what the coalition might do differently? I mean, you've said that Annika Wells isn't doing enough. You've pointed out her relative inexperience, having only taken on the portfolio since the election. Are there specific regulations your party would vote for or want to put in place here?
Look, we've been very clear that, if there is legislation that will actually add to the robustness of the system, that will support and be constructive in that kind of legislation across the board, not just in this space. But obviously we'll need to see what the government is looking to do before we make any comment in relation to that. But these are ongoing issues, and I was one of those customers that had their, personal information published like many others. What it highlights is that it's just not good enough, and not enough is being done to ensure that the essential elements of telecommunications are there for Australians when they need them. And the government has to step up. They cannot point to Optus. They can't just say this is their problem and that this is a commercial issue to be solved. This is the 000 network, and the government is accountable to ensure that that is actually working for Australians when they need it.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Sam, but this has made me think about getting a landline again if you can't rely on mobile phones. And it's certainly true that many of us, myself included, have relied on mobiles, and they're just not as stable a system as having these hardwired lines, right?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a landline, I don't know, in about 20 years. So
yeah, me neither.
I don't even know how I'd go about it. I'm sure it could be done.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. The wiring's there. Perhaps we should be using it for phones as well as our internet connections. All right. Well, we'll keep an eye on this one. 21 minutes past 9 is the time. You're on 702 ABC Radio Sydney, as well as ABC Radio around New South Wales and ABC Radio Canberra. Dom Knight here. And we're talking about current matters in politics with Maria Kovacic, who is Liberal Senator for New South Wales, and Samantha Maiden from news.com.au. Now, your organisation, Samantha's published a news poll last night with lots of interesting things in it. Probably the headline stat is that One Nation's primary vote has risen to 11%, almost double what it got at the election in May. I think it got about 6% of the primary vote. What does this surge, do you think, Sam, tell us about Australians' mood at the moment and their feelings towards our major parties?
Look, not much, a bit, I suppose. Look, I love Newspoll dearly with all my heart, but I do think at this stage in the electoral cycle, I think that you can read too much into these things. I think the flight to one nation, and this is purely speculation on my part. Look, it would be fueled in part, presumably, by people feeling a bit grumpy about the fact that the coalition seems in disarray, and it might be fueled by some people thinking that the coalition isn't right-wing enough. You can only assume. But a lot of the time I think that there's a little bit of a protest vote parking. I think after the election there's a tendency of voters to want to back in the decision that they made, so that tends to see the standing of the government lift a little bit after an election, because people are basically patting themselves on the back for what they
don't want
did.
They don't want to have buyer's remorse, you think?
Exactly. And so, look, so you'd be really worried if the government got in a landslide and their numbers sort of collapsed. And usually we see that associated with a policy change, like with Kevin Rudd and, making such a big deal out of climate change and then making the changes that he made. But I think that, at this stage in the electoral cycle, you don't want to read too much into those polls. And I think that they're a really interesting temperature gauge of where things are at. But, who would have thought for most of the Albanese government that they would have gotten back in with the sort of majority that they did? So
I don't think they did they? They were surprised by the result.
The Labor Party?
Yeah, weren't they?
Look, I think that they were surprised by. I think that when you talk to pollsters in parties, they have a range. They don't have a seat count, and it's always a question of how far that range blows out in either direction, right? And so there is an art and a science to it, but there is a lot of guesswork as well. And I think that it blew out to their wildest dreams.
Maria Kovacic, what's your take on these numbers? I mean, the coalition is clearly trying to reposition itself to some degree under Susan Lee. She was very upfront about that when she assumed the leadership. She wanted to break from where Peter Dutton had been. But we know that some of these debates, and immigration's the one that comes to mind, bearing in mind Andrew Hastie's experience with that, and some of the other issues, we're seeing people on the streets protesting about migration at the moment. How does the coalition identify a new position for itself while maintaining the support of its traditional supporters?
Look, I agree with Sam. I think early polls, particularly taken in the months straight after an election, are rarely particularly meaningful, frankly. Australians have just voted. The opposition is resetting its policy. People are, for the most part, politically tuned out. And what really counts for us is the work that we are doing now. This is where the hard work needs to be done. Our leader, Susan Lee, has been very clear that we're out there listening. And that's not just a talking point. That is a reality. We can't, after the result that we were given in May, we can't now just sit down and, write our own little manifesto about how we think things should be. We need to actually go out and understand and listen and take that knowledge and use that to develop meaningful policy. That's what Australians expect us to do.
So over a 3-year cycle, you're saying it's in the listening phase rather than in the hard policy development phase. That being the case, what are you hearing?
I'm hearing that people are particularly concerned still about the cost of living. They are concerned about the cost of food. They are concerned about the cost of electricity. They are concerned about the cost of housing. I've had a lot of people reach out in the past couple of weeks, particularly in relation to this 5% deposit guarantee that was released last week, or that began last week. The issues there are that this is a further pressure on demand without any supply side measures to help people buy houses. So it's one thing to go, we're going to enable you to get in without a deposit, but what are you actually going to buy? Where are the houses? Where are the properties? So that's been a real issue. People have spoken about that quite a bit.
How do you see the coalition positioning itself, Sam, after the fairly devastating defeat of Peter Dutton's ticket in the election? I mean, we've seen it in the UK, reform surging under that Labor government in the years since Keir Starmer was elected, with a kind of far-right anti-immigration position. You're not seeing that, though, in the tea leaves here in Australia with One Nation, from what you said earlier.
Oh, look, I think that the coalition is still lost in the jungle, and I don't think that's really surprising. I think they should be lost in the jungle after that sort of result, and they've got to work out what the way out is. And I suppose in simple terms, there is this argument of how do you balance, I suppose, recapturing some of the votes that were lost without being a pale, imitation of the Labor Party, and whether they need to tack right. Or how they need to balance this. And, a lot of the time these things, policies are obviously important, but a lot of the time it also does come down to how well a government is performing, whether it's on the nose, whether it's falling apart. Like a lot of the time there is this argument that governments lose elections rather than oppositions win them. I'm not sure I necessarily always believe in that. But I think that they're in a tricky spot, and they should be. And I think that they need to take this time to really rethink and rebuild the government in a really thoughtful way. And I think that it's in Australia's interest that they give themselves the time to do that. This is not something that you're going to be able to fix. You're not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again within 2 months or 3 months. It's a really big job.
Maria, we'll give you the last word on this. Have you got a map out of the jungle, and does it take you through winning back, say, the teal electorates?
The map for us moving forward is based on listening, a robust discussion amongst all of the people in our party room in relation to what the best pathway is to construct policy that not just meets the needs of Australians but their aspirations as well. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we have to accept, is that Australians rejected what we took to the last election. They gave us a very clear message about that, and it's now up to us to listen and understand that message and reshape what we're going to do to pitch ourselves as a credible alternative to this government that is failing in so many ways.
Maria Kovacic, great to have you with us in studio. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maria's the Senator for New South Wales, and watch this space, Samantha Maiden. You'll be watching at news.com.au. I think she's left there. There you go. It's 9:30 here on 702 and across New South Wales and the ACT. Good morning to Rhiannon and Solomon Marion in the newsroom.
Good morning, Don.